Our little village, Oakhaven, clings to the English coast like a limpet to a rock. It's a place where the sea mists roll in without warning, swallowing the cobbled streets whole. You can hear the mournful cry of the gulls, even when you cannot see them. The wind, a constant companion, whispers tales through the narrow alleyways and rattles the window panes of the old fishermen's cottages. It often sounds like hushed voices, sharing secrets best left undisturbed. Many an evening, as the gas lamps flicker to life, their glow diffused by the ever-present fog, one feels the weight of centuries pressing down. It's a quaint place, visitors say. Quaint perhaps, but Oakhaven has always had its share of shadows, its untold stories. The air here is thick with salt and something else, something older. A sense of melancholy perhaps, or maybe it's just the damp that seeps into your bones. We locals are used to it, of course. We've grown up with the rhythmic sigh of the waves against the shingle beach and the distant melancholic chime of St. Jude's clock tower. It tolls the hours, each one a reminder of time passing, or perhaps time that refuses to pass. The old mariners used to say the sea keeps its secrets well. And Oakhaven, nestled by that very sea, has learned a thing or two about keeping quiet. It's a place where the past isn't always past. Sometimes it just waits. Down by the harbour, the old wooden jetties creak and groan under the strain of the tides. They sound like old men complaining of their aches. The fishing boats, their paint peeling, bob gently, their ropes slapping against their masts in a restless rhythm. It's a sound that can lull you to sleep, or on certain nights keep you wide awake, listening for something more. The sort of nights when the fog is so dense it feels like a shroud, and the only sound is the drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves. That, and perhaps the faint, almost imagined strains of some sorrowful old string music carried on the breeze. Life in Oakhaven moves at its own pace, dictated by the seasons and the sea. We are a close-knit community, or so it appears. Everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. But even in a village as small as ours, there are corners where darkness lingers, where secrets are buried deeper than any anchor. And sometimes the tide has a nasty habit of bringing those secrets back to the surface, whether we want them to or not. The sea, you see, always claims its due. It's a lesson some learn too late. It was the autumn of '78, I recall. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, a brief splash of colour before the grey winter. A group of youngsters, fresh from their school days, were full of dreams. There was young Eleanor, or Ellie as she preferred, bright and ambitious, hoping to leave Oakhaven for the bright lights of London. Then there was James, her steady beau, a good lad if a little too easily led. He planned to join his father on the fishing trawlers, though his heart wasn't truly in it. He simply wanted to stay near Ellie for as long as he could. Such is the folly of youth, isn't it? Their little gang also included Sarah, quiet and observant, who always seemed to be sketching in her notepad. She noticed things others missed. And finally, there was Michael, a bit of a joker, always looking for the next bit of excitement. He was the one with the slightly battered Ford Cortina, a symbol of their fleeting freedom. They were on the cusp of adulthood, that precarious edge where innocence begins to fray. They thought the world was theirs for the taking, that the future was a bright, open road. Little did they know how quickly a fog could descend upon that road. They had just received their examination results, you see, cause for celebration, they thought. The world stretched before them, a canvas yet unpainted. Ellie was going to university, a scholarship no less. James was proud, though a little sad, knowing their paths might soon diverge. Sarah had plans for art college, while Michael was just happy to be done with school. They spent those last few weeks of late summer bleeding into early autumn in a bubble of youthful exuberance, blissfully unaware of the shadows gathering at the edges of their idyllic world. The distant clock chimed, marking their precious dwindling hours of innocence. Their laughter echoed along the promenade, a stark contrast to the usual quiet hum of Oakhaven. They were full of plans, big and small, bonfires on the beach, trips to nearby towns, dreams whispered under starry skies. When the fog allowed, of course, they felt invincible, as the young often do. They believed that nothing truly bad could ever touch them, that their friendship was a shield against the harsher realities of life. But Oak Haven has a way of reminding its inhabitants that some shields are more fragile than they appear. And that autumn, a particular darkness awaited them, lurking just around a bend in the coastal road. The night in question began like any other celebratory evening for them. It was a Friday, if memory serves. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of wood smoke and the ever-present salt from the sea. They gathered at the old Fisherman's Rest public house, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching twilight. Laughter and boasts filled their corner of the pub, fueled by a perhaps unwise quantity of local ale and cider. Michael was particularly boisterous, recounting tales of daring that grew taller with each pint. The creaking sign of the pub outside swung rhythmically in the rising wind, a soft, almost mournful sound. As the evening wore on, their spirits soared higher. They spoke of futures bright and bold, of adventures yet to come. Ellie, usually more reserved, found herself caught up in the infectious merriment. James watched her, his heart full, trying to memorize the way her eyes sparkled in the dim pub light. Sarah sketched them all on a napkin, her pencil strokes quick and sure, capturing a moment of fleeting happiness. Outside, the wind began to howl a little louder, a mournful dirge that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the old building. But inside, they were cocooned in their youthful optimism, deaf to its warning. Their decision to drive out to Blackwood Point was a spontaneous one, born of high spirits and a desire to prolong the night. Michael, ever the instigator, suggested it. "One last look at the sea before life scatters us," he'd declared, his voice a little too loud. Blackwood Point was a notorious spot, a windswept headland with treacherous cliffs. The road was narrow and winding, often slick with sea spray and shrouded in mist. The distant chimes of St. Jude's seemed to follow them as they piled into Michael's Cortina, the engine sputtering to life with a protesting cough. The old car radio crackled, playing some popular tune, barely audible above their chatter. The drive itself was reckless. The fog, as it so often does along our coast, had begun to roll in thick and fast, reducing visibility to mere feet. Michael drove too quickly, his confidence inflated by drink and the cheers of his friends. They sang songs, their voices loud and slightly off-key, oblivious to the dangers of the winding coastal road. The beams of the headlights cut feeble paths through the swirling grey, illuminating fleeting glimpses of gnarled trees and the dark churning sea below. Then, suddenly, a shape loomed out of the fog. A sickening thud. Silence, save for the idling engine and the sudden chilling whisper of the wind. Panic erupted in the small confines of the car. A raw, primal fear that stole their breath and sobered them in an instant. Michael slammed on the brakes, the tyres screeching on the wet road. For a moment no one spoke. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the insistent lapping of waves from the unseen beach below. Ellie was the first to whisper, "What was that? What did we hit?" Her voice trembled, a stark contrast to her earlier laughter. James, his face pale in the dashboard's faint glow, fumbled for the door handle, his mind struggling to comprehend the unthinkable. They stumbled out of the car into the dense, chilling fog. The air was heavy, pressing down on them. There, lying on the narrow verge, was a figure, a man, his form indistinct in the gloom. He was terribly still. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah, and she clapped a hand to her mouth. Michael, his earlier bravado vanished, stared in wide-eyed horror. The reality of what they had done, what had happened, began to crash down upon them with the force of a storm surge. The distant, mournful cry of a foghorn echoed across the water, a sound that seemed to signal their doom. It was James who checked for a pulse, his hand shaking so violently he could barely feel anything. He's gone," he stammered, his voice hollow. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. In that moment, their bright future shattered. The weight of their terrible secret descended. What followed was a frantic, whispered debate. Go to the police? But Michael was over the limit. Their lives, their careers, their families, all would be ruined. The fear, was a cold, tight knot in each of their stomachs. The whispering wind seemed to carry their panicked voices away into the darkness, offering no comfort, no solution. And so, in the swirling mists of Blackwood Point, under the indifferent gaze of a hidden moon, they made their fateful decision. A terrible pact, sealed by fear and desperation. They would hide the body. The sea, vast and deep, would be its resting place. With trembling hands and averted eyes, they carried the stranger's lifeless form towards the cliff edge. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below seemed to grow louder, hungrier. They vowed in hushed, terrified tones never to speak of that night or the man ever again. They would take this secret to their graves, or so they believed. The sea, however, rarely forgets. A year drifted by, as years tend to do, measured out by the changing tides and the tolling of St. Jude's bell. The autumn leaves fell once more, carpeting Oakhaven in shades of rust and gold. Ellie had gone to London, immersing herself in her studies, trying to build a wall of books and new faces between herself and that terrible night. James remained in Oakhaven, working on the trawlers, the vast, indifferent sea, a constant, grim reminder of their shared secret. The salt spray on his face often felt like icy tears. He found little joy in his work, each creak of the boat's timbers sounding like an accusation. Sarah had moved to Bristol for art college, but her sketches had taken a darker turn. Her canvases were filled with stormy seas, shadowy figures, and faces contorted in silent screams. The vibrant colours of her earlier work had been replaced by muted greys and blues. Michael, still in Oakhaven, tried to maintain his cheerful facade, but those who knew him well noticed a new wariness in his eyes, a tension around his mouth. He avoided Blackwood Point, and the Cortina gathered dust in his father's garage. The bond between the four friends, once so strong, had frayed, strained by the unspoken and the unspeakable. They communicated little, each preferring the isolation of their own guilt. An occasional stilted postcard was the most they managed. The silence between them was as thick and suffocating as the Oakhaven fog. They each carried the memory a heavy stone in their gut, a constant, dull ache. They hoped perhaps that time and distance would lessen the burden, that the sea would indeed keep its promise and hold their secret safe within its depths. But some secrets had a way of clawing their way back to the surface like a stubborn weed pushing through concrete. The past, you see, has very long fingers. Ellie tried hardest to forget, to build a new life far from the whispering winds and the accusing gaze of the sea. She convinced herself for a time that it was possible, that the memory would fade, become a distant, hazy nightmare. She told herself they had done the only thing they could. But late at night, when the city was quiet, she would sometimes hear the faint, imagined sound of waves crashing, and the image of that still form on the foggy road would flash before her eyes. Sleep offered little respite, often bringing dreams filled with swirling mists and accusing, unseen eyes. The distant clock chimes of a London church would sometimes morph into the tolling of St. Jude's. It was when Ellie returned to Oakhaven for the autumn half-term break that the fragile peace shattered completely. She had hoped the familiar surroundings might bring some comfort, a sense of normalcy. Instead, the village felt more oppressive than ever, the fog seeming to cling to her, heavy and damp. The sea breeze, once refreshing, now carried a chill that had nothing to do with the season. She found a letter waiting for her, tucked into the old brass letterbox of her parents' cottage. It was a plain envelope with no return address. Her name was scrawled across the front in crude block capitals. Inside, on a single sheet of cheap paper, were 5 stark words, typed as if by an unsteady hand. "I know what you did last autumn." The ink was slightly smudged. For a long moment, Ellie simply stared at it, her blood turning to ice. The paper trembled in her hand. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to magnify, each tick a hammer blow against her sanity. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, sounding like a dry, rasping chuckle. The past which she had tried so desperately to bury, had just announced its unwelcome return. Her first instinct was to call James. His voice, when he answered, was strained. He too had received a note. Then Sarah, her voice barely a whisper, confirmed the same. Michael, when they finally reached him, sounded shaken, his usual bravado entirely gone. The four of them, once inseparable, now bound by a terrifying new threat, agreed to meet. The old boathouse down by the abandoned part of the harbour, a place they used to frequent in happier times, seemed the only suitably private location for their panicked reunion. The creaking of its weathered timbers in the wind would provide a fitting soundtrack to their fear. As they gathered, the air in the boathouse was thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations. Their carefully constructed lives were crumbling. Who could have sent the notes? Was it a cruel prank, or was it something far more sinister? Each of them looked at the others, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Had one of them cracked under the pressure? Had someone confessed or let something slip? The paranoia began to set in, an insidious poison, turning them against each other. The distant rhythmic clang of a buoy bell drifted in from the misty sea, each chime like a nail being hammered into a coffin. The days that followed were filled with a mounting dread. The anonymous notes were just the beginning. Strange things started to happen, small at first, then escalating. Ellie would find her bedroom window slightly ajar, even though she was certain she had locked it, the curtains billowing inward, as if an unseen presence had just departed. She'd hear faint echoing footsteps in the corridor outside her room late at night, only to find no one there when she plucked up the courage to look. The whispering wind seemed to carry her name, a chilling susurrus just beyond the edge of hearing. James, out on his father's trawler, felt he was being watched. From the dense fog banks that often surrounded the boat, he would sometimes glimpse a dark shape, a figure standing silently on the distant shrouded shoreline, visible for only a moment before vanishing. The creaking of the boat's timbers seemed louder, more insistent, as if the vessel itself was trying to warn him. One evening, the nets brought up not fish, but a sodden, tattered fisherman's sou'wester hat, eerily similar to the one the man they had hit might have worn. He threw it back into the churning water with a shudder. Sarah found her art studio disturbed. Sketches of the accident, ones she thought she had hidden away securely, were laid out on her desk, rearranged into a macabre tableau. The room would grow suddenly cold, and she'd hear the faint scratching of a pencil, as if someone were drawing beside her, unseen. The ominous, low strings of some imagined horror film score seemed to play constantly in the back of her mind. Michael's Cortina, which he hadn't touched in a year, had its tires slashed one night. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, except for the mournful howl of the wind through the eaves of the garage. The friends met again, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The initial suspicion of each other was slowly being replaced by a more terrifying thought that they were being stalked by someone or something connected to that fateful autumn night. They were being picked off. Psychologically at first, the village of Oakhaven, once their home, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every unexplained noise sent their hearts racing. The distant clock chimes of St. Jude's no longer marked the passing of time, but seemed to be counting down to some dreadful reckoning. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Ellie and James began to investigate. They had to know who the man was, the man whose life they had so tragically cut short. Their inquiries, hushed and fearful, started at the old Fisherman's Rest. The landlord, a weathered old sea dog named Silas, remembered a stranger in town around that time. A quiet man, kept to himself. He'd been asking about local fishing rights, Silas recalled, and mentioned he was new to the area looking for a fresh start. He'd paid for his room in advance, then vanished without a trace. No one had reported him missing. Their search led them to the small, cluttered room above the pub where the stranger had stayed. It was just as he'd left it, untouched for a year. Dust lay thick on the sparse furniture. Rummaging through the few meagre belongings left behind, some worn clothes, a dog-eared book of sea shanties, They found a faded photograph. It showed the stranger, younger, smiling, standing on a quayside with a woman and a young boy. On the back, a scrawled name, Ben Thackeray, and beneath it, Oakhaven. This man wasn't a stranger to their village after all. He had roots here, deep and tangled. Further discreet questions around the older residents of Oakhaven began to paint a disturbing picture. Ben Thackeray, it turned out, was the son of a once prominent local fishing family. A family that had fallen on hard times, losing their boats and livelihood due to a bitter, long-forgotten feud with another Oakhaven clan, a feud involving accusations of theft and betrayal. And that other clan? It was the family of none other than Michael, their friend, the driver of the car that night. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a chilling mosaic of past grievances and present terror. The man they had killed was not just a random stranger. He was returning to Oakhaven, perhaps to reclaim something of his family's lost honor, or maybe to settle old scores. His connection to Michael's family was a revelation that sent a fresh wave of horror through Ellie and James. Was this revenge then? Was a living relative of Ben Thackeray tormenting them, or was it something else, something older and far more patient? The creaking wood of the old pub seemed to groan under the weight of these dark discoveries, and the wind outside whispered Thackeray's name. The culmination came, as it so often does in Oakhaven down by the sea, on the old, dilapidated fishing docks, shrouded in the densest fog they had ever witnessed. Ellie, guided by a final cryptic clue found in Thackeray's room, a marked map of the old Thackeray family fishing grounds, went there alone, convinced the tormentor would reveal themselves. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the lapping of water against the rotting pylons and the distant mournful wail of a foghorn. Each creak of the timbers beneath her feet sounded like a footstep following close behind. There, at the end of the longest pier, stood a figure, silhouetted against the grey nothingness. It was not a person she recognized. It was gaunt, spectral, its clothes tattered and dripping with seawater. As it turned, its eyes seemed to glow with an eerie luminescence. It was Ben Thackeray, or rather, the vengeful spirit of Ben Thackeray returned from his watery grave. But as he raised a pointing hand, not towards Ellie but towards the village itself, she realized the horrifying truth. He was not alone. Other indistinct, sorrowful figures began to emerge from the mist, spirits of others wronged by Oakhaven, their forms shimmering. Thackeray's voice, when it came, was like the grinding of stones, a sound carried on the chilling wind. He spoke not of personal revenge against the four friends alone, but of a deeper, older curse upon Oakhaven. Their accident had not been random, it was fate, replaying an ancient pattern. Generations ago, his ancestors were wronged, their livelihoods stolen, their pleas for justice ignored by the village. Now each generation of Oakhaven was unknowingly bound to pay for those old sins. The sea, he rasped, always demands its due. Their act was merely the latest installment in a long, bloody ledger. As the first pale light of dawn began to penetrate the oppressive fog, the spectral figures, including Thackeray, slowly receded, fading back into the mist like a nightmare dissolving with the morning. Ellie was left trembling, the terrible weight of the village's curse settling upon her. It wasn't just their secret, it was Oakhaven's. The cycle would continue. The past was not buried, it was merely dormant, waiting for the tide to turn. Later that day, catching her reflection in a mirror, she thought she saw a fleeting shadow behind her, a flicker of movement in the glass. And from the harbour, clear and cold, came the sound of the foghorn, a chilling promise that the legend of Oakhaven would endure.